Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome. I'm delighted to have you join us for today's Lexology Masterclass in collaboration with Mason. It is magnificent to see our audience tune in. We have a really insightful session lined up for you today with our speakers, Arthur, Simon, Shweta, and Michael, sharing practical perspectives, insights, and key takeaways that we hope you'll find both valuable and beneficial in your work. Just before we begin, a few quick housekeeping points. Please do use the Q&A tool to submit any questions throughout the session for the speaker to address. If you experience any technical difficulties, please do let us know via that same Q&A tool and a member of our events team will be happy to assist you. And finally, just another reminder that today's session is being recorded and we'll be sharing that recording with you via email in the coming days so that you can revisit or share them with your team. That's everything from me. Without further ado, I'm pleased to hand it over to our speakers to get us started.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Today's session will cover turbine failures and arbitration claims. Turbines are at the heart of power generation projects, and when they fail, the consequences extend far beyond technical repairs. What often begins as a mechanical or operational issue can quickly escalate into significant commercial and legal disputes. Hi, I'm Shweta Shrivastava from Expert Services at Mason. Over the past few years, I have been involved in various arbitration matters wherein the construction projects have been impacted due to turbine defects and performance issues, derailing timelines, inflating budgets, and introducing serious safety risks. Today's discussion will focus on how turbine failures evolve from technical breakdowns into complex arbitration claims and how experts and legal teams work together to analyze causation, quantity losses, and present evidence which effectively are used in dispute resolution process. Let me introduce the panels on this session today. First, we have Arthur Carlisle. Arthur is a chartered mechanical engineer with over 30 years of experience in power generation, industrial plants, and project development. He has held senior roles internationally, managing major coal, oil, and gas energy facilities. Arthur's expertise covers a wide range of plant and equipment, including gas turbines, steam systems, and wind and solar farms. Arthur is a seasoned expert witness in international arbitrations, providing expert reports and testimony. Welcome, Arthur. Next on the
Thank you.
panel, Next on the panel, we have Simon Bellas, partner at HFW. Simon is an international lawyer focusing on complex construction projects, claims, and dispute across various sectors, including major infrastructure, offshore construction, energy, mining, power, and transport. He routinely acts for large international contractors and has managed some of the largest international arbitrations and litigation in Asia Pacific region. Simon has significant experience with extension of time, variation, defective work, delay and disruption claims, as well as advising on contract termination issues. I welcome you, Simon.
Thank you.
Next, we have Michael Arada Greenop, counsel at Wilmer Cutler Pickering Hale and Dorr in London. Michael is a counsel in the litigation department and is a member of International Arbitration Practice Group. Michael's practice focuses on commercial and investment treaty arbitrations. He has represented clients in arbitrations under most of the leading institutional rules across range of industries and in regions spanning Europe, Asia, Americas, Africa, and the Middle East. I welcome all of my esteemed speakers today. So let us begin with the session. So, firstly, let us understand from the technical expert itself about typical turbine failures and causes and how these technical issues are addressed in disputes. So, over to you, Arthur. In your experience, what are the typical turbine defects and at what stages they are usually encountered?
Um, Thanks, Shweta. Well, I'm going to start with, I want to break this up into two. There's gas turbines and steam turbines, and they're quite different machines and they behave differently, and we see different panels, different failures, etc. But let's start with gas turbines, which can become a lot more prevalent. The most common failures that I normally come across, and I've done quite a few of them in the last few years, is blade and vane liberations. They break off, and when we get down to the brass tacks and we get right into the investigation, it normally relates to design issues. Either there's a resonance vibrations or there's an overload issue. To a lesser extent, sometimes there's foreign objects that come in, they get ingested by the gas turbine and cause havoc. And also, notable thing about these failures, you have one small little blade fail, but it passes through the turbine and the destruction is extensive. If you look at the bottom picture on the slide there, you can see there was one of those blades broke off and you can see it just about took every other one off. And the materials are expensive, very expensive, and these costs can be always multiples of 10 million, and long repairs as well. The gas turbine failures we often see is lubrication failures. This is normally around blackout events, standbys. Again, the damage appears not to be rectification takes a long time and there's a lot more work. This often relates to equipment maintenance or operational issues, but not always. Sometimes we get extensive vibrations. Tends to relate more to operational issues and maintenance issues. And then lastly, for gas turbines, the other type of failures we see quite a bit of is combustion chamber failures. We have parts breaking off and passing through the turbine and cause all that destruction. When we go to steam turbines, all steam turbines are bespoke. Where the gas turbines are generally one design, steam turbines might be based on a master design or a concept, or they're all tailored for each and every site. So they are bespoke, and that means blades are different. And a lot of times we see blade cracking liberations. Normally these are more operational issues, not always. It's corrosion, water treatment. Sometimes also we have vibrations and resonance, which relates to the design issues. The rotor failures, and I've seen quite a few lately, surprisingly. These have always related to material issues and material selection issues. We see blade wear, this is more operational, where we get erosion. And then also we get the lubrication failures, which we deal with quite a bit. So that just gives you a rough idea of the type of failures we see. Again, all of them major repairs, not just the part that fails, it's a consequential damage that's extensive. Should I do the next two questions as well?
Let me just have a follow-up question
Yeah.
on that. So these defects, in my experience, they are usually classified as design defects, manufacturing defect, or operational defects. How do you classify these defects into various categories like this?
Well, normally when we and I say this as an engineer in a way, but invariably we need to blame somebody because for the litigation we've got to identify the cause, and out of that it comes to design. I'd say on gas turbines, I think it's more design issues that we see. The industry has been developing, over the last 50 years quite a lot. The temperatures are very, very high. All the materials are specially developed. So we tend to see operational issues we do have. They often they are blamed, but they're not operational issues. But that's the way the things, and we'll go into that later. And then manufacturing or installation issues are also, and again, normally, not always, but normally the manufacturing and the installation is all related to the designers. It's the same company. Most of these gas turbines these days are maintained by the manufacturers, not entirely. That's sort of the trend worldwide. So it comes back to the same bodies.
So, Arthur, remember we recently worked on a technical matter and where you acted as a technical expert and you had to deal with the issue of fitness for purpose. So, how do you deal with this issue from a technical perspective? Would you like to share your experience on that project? Or maybe some other
Um,
project where you have dealt with such issues with regards to fitness for purpose from a technical standpoint?
yeah, in that particular project, the manufacturer supplied equipment. And although it could do the job eventually, it took them a long time to get there. Our view was, or my view was, that when you bought this machine, you expected it to work. And really, their fitness for purpose were in a development phase. And even so, when they finally got it to work, it wasn't exactly what was required. In terms of the contract, when you're buying a machine, you expect it to have that performance. The way the manufacturer said, well, we know these are fairly new designs and we should still keep working. And that was the difference. When you buy these plants, they're very expensive. And when you need them to work, you can't have constant breakdowns that are also fairly expensive to repair. In that particular case, we looked at the performance, we looked at all the defects that came up, and we said, well, your delivery date was X. It was months, in fact, years later before you really achieved them all in a working state. So in terms of the contract, from there on, they would do the job. You don't buy a machine for development, you buy it for that. So that's what we did there. But we looked at the defects, and they all related back to design and needing further development and work and sorting out.
And I think in that matter itself, you were also involved in assessing the root cause analysis. So would you like to take us through the RCA process and the steps and how it is, how it stands up to the scrutiny in dispute proceedings?
All right. What I thought with the RCA process, thought I'd rather just approach it how I normally approach or would like to approach it. Now, often with arbitrations, it's years later and we get data and it's not all there. One of the biggest problems I have, is getting correct data and getting the right data. We often get a lot of data, it's not the right stuff. So in a perfect world, if we can get involved with a failure, and let's take a gas turbine that fails. The way it's a bit of a scenario that actually happened to me. The way I like to approach it is if we get to site as early as possible when they open the gas turbine, and when they open it and we can look. And the first thing we look at is the damage pattern. Because often there's a lot of damage, but it's all consequential. You've got to find the first item that failed. And we can identify that. And the next thing is, especially with some of the more powerful turbine OEMs, is those parts disappear and they believe it's their property. It's not. And we can secure those parts and all the other samples we need for further analysis. And we can secure them, prevent corrosion because that can often damage them. And then the next step is we go and do the metallurgical investigations. And we often invite all the parties to join. We draw up a protocol with hold points. We don't do anything or damage to chemical cleaning to the parts till everybody agrees. Now we go into all the investigation. And in this particular case, a vane had failed. The manufacturer said it was a foreign object. That operator had allowed a foreign object to come in, and that failed the vane. By the time we went through the lab investigation, we confirmed there was no foreign object damage. It was not what caused it. There was no operational issues. And we couldn't also find a defect in the material. So the next phase is we went into a scenario where we modeled the blade. OEM wouldn't give us information. We had to scan the blades, work out them. And we did a lot of modeling on vibrations. And we actually managed to prove that this was a design issue where blades were resonating and they were vibrating very high. And no wonder they were failing. So that goes a long way back where the OEM just said, you didn't keep the filters properly looked after, and a foreign object came in and the case is closed. So that's the ideal case. You can get to site, you can know what's wrong, secure the right spares, control or participate, but have meaningful influence in the investigations and make sure some pieces aren't put to the side and come with the right answer. My experience is when you get that far, also natural. People tend to accept it. It's when we get these vague answers. It must have been a foreigner. We can't find evidence, but what else? Those sort of things just don't work. You've got to when you get all that together, and it's a nice tight picture. That's the way to do it. But often, unfortunately, we're years later, and the information comes through. A lot of it, but often no relevance or a little bit manipulated or streamlined. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much on that. Moving on to the next topic, which is framing the arbitration claim. So, as we have just heard from Arthur about the typical turbine failures and the technical impacts it has on a project, such technical issues do lead to disputes between the parties and submission of various claims. Let us understand how such claims should be framed in an arbitration. So my question is to Michael. Michael, how do you frame these claims in a technical arbitration? Should these claims be structured around delay, cost, performance loss, or all three of them? Over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Shweta. And it's great to hear Arthur's comments because I think that kind of nicely sets up where I'm wanting to go with this answer. And that's because when we're talking about turbine failure, we're often almost never talking about a single broken component by the time we're actually getting to the dispute. As Arthur said, one blade can cascade and cause a whole raft of issues that usually by the time it ends up before the tribunal, we're talking the entire turbine being effectively destroyed in parts and you're trying to find what the root cause was. But usually you're speaking about a layered claim where the technical failure actually translates to a mix of delay, cost, and long-term performance consequences. And just before I get into how we actually go about strategically framing that claim, it's useful to try think, and I think Arthur did this in part, thinking, factually, where do the failures occur? It's useful to think about where these disputes usually can be grouped in terms of the general buckets. We heard about defect claims, and I'm not talking about design defect. I'm talking about defects in terms of turbine compartments and the overall turbine failing to meet contractual specifications or technical schedules, industry standards, or regulatory requirements. And I won't get into the detail on the typical sort of contractual claims. I think we'll cover that later, or the provisions that are usually engaged. But this is usually one area of a type of claim. It's the defects for non-compliance, and the underlying issue might be a matter of defective materials. It might be manufacturing. It might be control systems or certain safety features. It really kind of depends on the specific situation you're faced with. The second general bucket is the design angle, which Arthur was covering. And usually, I think these are particularly strategically important when it comes to framing claims, because where there's a design issue and where you're talking potentially about a fleet of turbines, where you find an isolated failure, that's not usually the only failure you're going to spot. That signifies you might be talking about a much bigger claim that could affect the entire fleet. And this bucket here is usually that involving where the problem has effectively been baked in right from the outset. Inadequate load modeling, incorrect site assumptions, gearbox or bearing design flaws, blade fatigue, all of these elements we typically see. The third bucket is performance and output shortfalls. And these are where we might see that the turbine could be operating. So technically, it's not failing insofar as it's able to operate, but it fails to meet guaranteed availability, efficiency, power curves, you name it. That's another entire bucket of claims. And then the final, and I would still classify that as a turbine failure because it's not achieving what it was setting out to achieve in the first place. And the last bucket is reliability, maintenance, and operational risk type claims. This is where you have repeated outages or the need for excessive maintenance early on or accelerated degradation, which would often signal that this is going to be an asset that's fundamentally less reliable than initially promised. And the loss here might not just be today's outage where you need additional maintenance or some sort of fix, but rather signifying higher O&M costs down the line and potentially a shortened asset life. And there could be claims involved with that. So that leads us to how do we actually frame that type of claim? And I think the key point is this, that tribunals are very rarely persuaded by treating each as standalone claims, a delay claim, a cost claim, and a performance claim individually. It feels a little fragmented and quite frankly artificial when you're actually considering what really happened. Tribunals much better or much more likely respond to a situation where counsel working together with the experts can show that one particular failure or technical or contractual failure has set off a chain of events and consequences across the project. And that then leads to this building of a narrative across various layers like a cake. So we start with initially the core contractual promise. What was the contractor or the OEM or designer supposed to actually deliver? What did they promise? Then we lead to the question, what was the critical technical failure that undermined that promise? And that requires early engagement with an expert to try to get to the bottom of that. Because very often, as Arthur pointed out, each side is going to take a particular case theory and want to pitch that narrative, regardless of whether or not that actually reflects the reality. And only once you've actually established what was the promise and what was the critical technical failure that undermined it, should you then think about the rest that follows somewhat naturally. Because the defect existed, commissioning was delayed. Because it was delayed, costs escalated. Because the technical solution never worked properly, the asset then underperformed. So instead of presenting each as separate claims, and while you are, strictly in a document, you'd be setting these out as separate heads of claim, you're really effectively trying to tell a single story as counsel. And in practice, that means organizing your case around three linked questions. One, what went wrong technically? And those are the points that Arthur was covering. Two, how did that failure affect the overall project delivery? And which provisions would then be triggered, which we'll get onto shortly. And finally, what value was lost as a result? And that effectively mirrors how a tribunal is going to be thinking about this case that you have in front of you if you're dealing with a turbine failure. Liability first, causation arguably second, and quantum then that follows after that. How are you quantifying your loss? And that avoids a situation where you fall into the trap of a kitchen sink style pleading. So I'll pause there. That's my answer on framing claims.
So about the issue of quantifying the losses, could you please talk us through what kind of quantifiable damages are claimed due to turbine failures in international arbitration?
Sure. And I'm careful here when I'm answering this question because to a large extent, this really depends on quantum experts and other experts to guide what sort of heads of loss you should be claiming. But it's also important not to think about the different heads of loss as a checklist. It's important to show that there are different financial consequences that flow from the same underlying technical failure. Once again, you're building this layer cake, and that's what we're trying to achieve. But generally speaking, we can group the typical types of loss you can be seeking. The first category I'd cover is probably the most straightforward, which is the direct repair or replacement costs where that might be possible. And that might include for failed blades, rotors, bearings, control systems, you name it. These are usually the most immediate losses and often the easiest for us to evidence, assuming we have access to the equipment and the documents, which is a big assumption, of course, as Arthur was making the point. But these are usually the easiest with contemporaneous records for us to justify. If we then take that to the next level, turbine failures frequently lead as well to outage-related revenue losses. Forced outages or deratings might prevent the unit from running at all, or it might run not at its contracted level. And depending on the project structure, this can translate into lost availability payments, reduced capacity payments, lost PPA revenue, replacement power costs, or contractual outage penalties if there is a provision in the contract providing for it. The third bucket is efficiency and performance degradation losses, which, and I'm subject here to the views of my co-panelists, would typically come up in gas turbine type disputes. Here we're talking about a degraded heat rate, increased fuel consumption, or failure to meet performance guarantees, which can generate continuing economic loss, even where the plant might remain online. The fourth and final, which I would cover, is delay-related losses. And these are sometimes more challenging to establish as counsel, but it helps to have a decent expert on board to help quantify these. These include missed commercial operation dates, prolongation and extended overhead costs, exposure to liquidated damages, and sometimes loss of incentives or other regulatory benefits that would depend on timely completion of a project. But what really matters, and I think this is the point I started with, is not simply identifying these various heads of loss, but actually proving the causal chain between what is your technical failure and each financial consequence. And tribunals are far less persuaded by damages schedules that read effectively like a shopping list for the sake of it than by cases that show step by step, with the assistance of expert evidence, how a specific defect or non-conformity has produced each layer or category of loss. And that's why I would finish by saying early and close coordination between your technical, your delay, and your quantum experts is critical in these types of technical disputes. That's my answer.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah. So I think Arthur and yourself have both to focus on the importance of the documentation and how it can affect a case. So my next question is for Simon on the same issue. So in your experience, which documentary evidence are required to prove a case in technical arbitration? Even Arthur, you can always pitch in this question.
Okay, well, I make a list of what we typically need and also what we get. But from a pure technical point, and I know when we get into arbitration, we get into all these emails and this guy said that and that. But long before that, what we really need is the O&M manuals, the operating and maintenance manuals. We need some drawings, and I know that often manufacturers won't release everything, which is fair enough, but there's a lot of drawings we can get. We need layout drawings. And nothing else, if nothing else, when we write our reports, at least we can describe and show tribunal what we're talking about. Because otherwise it's very difficult to bring these concepts across. Then another one is the operational data and how that's presented and how we get that. Now, there is a slide that I gave you. I don't know if you want to go to, and I'll just go down there. It's a little bit of a case study, but I'll just show you. There was a slide I sent you on the slides that I sent you. You can go down.
Let me just move to that slide. Is this the one?
That's the one. Forget the left-hand picture. We'll talk about that later, but the right-hand picture. The top curve is what was in the individual allegations. And if you look in the middle, there's 5 little black curves. And they have that green curve and it's got those spikes. I put them up there with little red arrows. Out of this whole thing, this whole allegation that this turbine was shaking itself apart. And we looked at it, and the first thing it came across was there's different scales and different information. And also, all of this is compacted on one side. It's in a very, why didn't they show the more detail? A long story, we finally got to site. We managed to go and extract the data, and we could analyze it. And we redrew this area where these high vibrations were. If you look at the curves below, and the little picture below is what we then represented. I'm saying, no nonsense, the vibrations weren't high. And that red curve, where the little arrows, that was the actual vibrations when we put everything on the same scale. They play around with scales, didn't quite understand what was being measured. They got the units mixed up. That graphic picture. So when you get it right and you show this, there's a fine dotted red line. That's actually sort of the best performance. That's in the sort of, below that, it's excellent vibrations. And it was only 1 beep, which normally occurs there. So when you can show that, so that to us is, we actually got the raw data. We could then put it into a right pattern and show the thing. So those are main things we need. Often it's not available. Can't always get it. Often when we work with old claims, we try and get as many of the previous RCA reports, and depending on who the authors were. We can try and see which one they were pushing, and we can try and work out something from that. It is difficult, especially when it's you're way down the line, and that's just the nature of the job. You've got to accept that that's the nature of it. But those are the main thing: operational data, technical details of the machine, and then the details of the specific incident. But preferably pure details, operator logs, and not filtered or in somebody's view. One of the things we've learned, if you go to site, you get a good or better idea, feel and touch. And if you can get the operators on their own, they normally really know what happened. They just won't say that. But if you could spend an afternoon with them and go through it, and not in a sort of taking a witness statement, but just chatting to them, you get the context of what. Oh no, we have this all the time. Oh no, this has occurred before. That sort of stuff. We have it all again. Anyway, I think that gives you an idea of what we need.
Yeah. Simon, would you like to, explain this further on the documentary evidence?
Well, perhaps I'll firstly just say that a lot of the points that both Arthur and Michael have made are both really striking a chord on the turbine failure cases that I've worked on. I particularly most recently worked on a case where there was a dispute between an O&M contractor and an owner of a power plant where there was a failure, and you get into that situation where it is a blame game. You come up with the competing theories as to what happened before we've actually really gotten in and sort of worked it all out, and people are trying to gather the evidence that supports their theory. And of course, the evidence that will best support your theory is documents that are accurate, reliable, contemporaneous, and objective. And you get that from hopefully independent inspections of the actual failure itself. Then, as Arthur mentioned, obviously the operational data that can just be downloaded from the various systems, and then going off to get third-party analysis done. So I think those are the things that we're looking for in terms of the theory. You really need to look at who are the stakeholders. So you may be acting for an owner, an O&M contractor, EPC contractor. There's obviously suppliers, manufacturers, third parties that could be involved, and insurers. And then there's various different contractual documents that sort of sit underneath that provide a matrix of obligations, and really you sift through that, and there will be a system of seeking to point the finger at the other party. And I think what's really important, both Michael and Arthur mentioned, is getting the teams together quickly, where you have external counsel, internal counsel, and the project teams and relevant experts coming together and working towards how are we going to develop our case theory, and how are we going to deal with their case theory, and doing all of that in a privileged environment can be quite challenging.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
Yes.
I'll add to
Yes.
that, Simon. I feel strongly. I often have it. You get questions, and I'm saying, I think we should sit down and understand what the issues are. And also, what do you want from us? Because sometimes we're not sure. You get some questions. Let's just go through and have a look exactly what failed, why it failed, or let's understand where we must explore. I agree with you. Early on, before we get into writing reports, we should meet with counsel, even the other experts, have a workshop type. Sure, in a privileged environment, but to have a workshop so we understand. And when we go out there, because I've often written reports and they've come back and said, no, but we had another idea, and I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is obviously so technical, and there less experience that I would have had that you would have had in these sorts of RCA processes is that, there really are a lot of overlapping potential causes. There's a lot of knowns and known unknowns, disagreements about not just what the cause is, but also how the root cause analysis should actually be done. So the process of elimination, going through and identifying, well, at least we can say it wasn't this as a cause, for example.
Yeah. Thank you for this discussion. So Michael, he just spoke about the different kind of claims which can be raised, with regards to the turbine failures. But yeah, of course, it all depends on the contract clauses. So with that, Simon, in your experience, which contract clauses are most triggered in turbine defect cases? Would you like to, share your experience on some of the cases as well?
Sure. Well, look, I think we have touched upon that already, and what I would
Yeah.
say, um, it, where there's a turbine failure, perhaps the first thing that comes to mind is um, a defective work provision and obligations, obviously, to repair or replace. There are also provisions of the contract that will deal with the proper response to a failure, including the obligation to perform an RCA, reporting, and potential improvements. There's going to be a whole raft of potential warranties that have been breached and standards of performance, so that you have to track through all of that. And then I think Michael mentioned uh, quite eloquently the various performance and output shortfall provisions that then have implications to either a liquidated damages regime or just a reduction in the amount of revenue or the price that the contractor is able to charge during that period. Where the cause is not known, you may well be also dealing with force majeure type provisions and potential claims.
Yeah. So now I want to move to the next topic, and I find this topic really interesting, and I think you all would be having a good discussion on this one. So this is integrating expert work into the legal strategy. So this is what I think. So expert findings often form the foundation of claims and defenses, ensuring the technical analysis and aligning with the legal framework would help establish the claims and the causation in a better manner. And Michael also mentioned that having a technical expert or any kind of expert early on in a matter is always helpful. So with that in mind, I would like to ask the legal experts over here about how important is expert selection in such technical disputes. What all do you look for in a technical expert in such matters?
You go first, Michael.
Yeah.
Sure. I think it's safe to say, and you would gather it from my earlier answer, that I think selection of the expert is absolutely critical. And expert is the wrong term here because there's experts usually involved in turbine failure cases. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest that the outcome of the arbitration will often turn on the credibility and the quality of the expert evidence that you can bring forward in a case. These are highly technical disputes. Tribunals are going to rely heavily on the experts to understand what went wrong, why it mattered, and whether the claimed consequences really flow from the alleged failure. And they're likely to look past the generic narratives that counsel might like to put forward to actually rely on what is the expert evidence behind it. So with that, that means that expert selection truly is a core strategic decision that needs to be made when clients are facing these sort of disputes. And I guess the process really starts very early on. Before you even start to think about expert names, you need to be clear on what experts you actually need in order to prove your case. Is this a case about root cause? Is it a systemic design risk type issue? Is it a commissioning failure? Is this about long-term performance degradation? different issues require different expertise. And one of the biggest mistakes that you can make in arbitration is appointing a technically impressive expert who is not well matched to the real battleground in the case at hand. They might be a generic industry expert, but they might not understand the specific issues that actually come into play. Now, once those issues are defined, the expert selection process becomes typically a fairly structured exercise. You start first with looking at what is the technical expertise or the experience that this expert brings to bear in the specific technology or failure mode at issue, not just general industry expertise. That then leads to the next stage, which is to consider what sort of arbitration experience has this expert faced? And that can be important in an arbitration for a variety of reasons. They need to be familiar with working in an adversarial process, because often they might be forced into a situation where they might need to have a joint expert call or do what's called hot tubbing, which is far less exciting than it sounds, but will be faced with experts from the tribunal, will be faced from questions from the tribunal where both experts are sat together having to answer, and they need to be aware of what that process might mean for the evidence that they're giving and the case that you're making. Are they able to withstand cross-examination? Are they familiar with that process? And crucially, are they able to translate complicated technical points of information into something that a tribunal can understand? Are they able to simplify it and hit those key points, not just bury them in technical volume? The third is credibility and robustness. How is the expert likely to be perceived by the tribunal once their CV, prior appointments, and professional history have been properly scrutinized? We can gather a lot of this from the materials they can send us in advance or the directories, but to be frank, a lot of directories are always only going to cover the positive aspects anyhow, and really you've got to meet them on calls and get that general impression before you raise it with your client and say, these are my thoughts on these experts. Here's the short list that I'm willing to go with, and I trust X, Y, or Z. What you can also do, and I'll finish on this point. I don't want to take all the points that Simon can cover, but one last point that is crucial in these technical cases is starting to float some of their preliminary thoughts on these issues. Of course, they can't commit to certain opinions early on, especially when they haven't seen the full body of evidence. But what they can do is give you an idea as to how they think and how they approach an issue, which can be relevant later on when you're making assumptions around what sort of evidence you're likely to have access to. So I'll stop there.
I'll just quickly make the point that I think we need to remember that experts their role is to act as independent experts to assist the tribunal to come to the right answer. And whilst we are in an adversarial system, there is a tension, therefore, that if an expert has been appointed by one party, that they will be wanting to assist that party in achieving a successful outcome. But the only way that that can be achieved is by having credibility, and you have credibility by not only being having great expertise and experience, but it's in taking a reasonable and robust approach, insisting upon being properly briefed, having sensible assumptions that don't undermine the expertise of the expert, and also making well-made concessions. I prefer having an expert that doesn't give me a perfect answer on everything, but rather gives me a pretty good answer on most things that really matter. Because when they are faced with those questions in the hot tub, hopefully they will be seen as the party that is less partisan and more objectively honest.
Thank you for that. Okay, the next question which I want all of you to, discuss upon is about the integration into legal strategy. So, in your experience, it's for all of you, where do technical and legal teams most often misalign? So, maybe Simon, you can answer it first.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think misalignment with respect to experts isn't necessarily the biggest issue as between the the expert and the legal team on one side of the case, but rather the experts and legal team from one side of the case moving forward with their analysis and producing an advanced draft report in isolation from the other side's expert, where there hasn't been engagement as between the two different experts. So then the tribunal is left with this ships in the night problem where they have to compare apples with oranges rather than apples with apples. It's really difficult for the tribunal to assess one expert saying, my conclusion is this, but I've looked at different documents and I've taken a different approach, to the opponent expert that says, well, I've come up with a different conclusion, but I've looked at different documents and taken a different approach. So I think as a result of that, we've seen this advent of tribunals appointing their own experts to assess that and to wade through it, but also insisting upon that earlier engagement between the experts to sort of see, well, what can we agree on in terms of what if the document is briefed to one expert, why should it not automatically be briefed to the other? And the questions be as much as possible considered by both experts.
I have a follow-up question on that. So sometimes the initial analysis or the conclusions given by the experts contradict with your original legal theory. So how do you deal with those issues? So the expert who is giving you some opinion, he would do some initial analysis and he would share his outcomes with you before the filing, just in case. But if that initial findings does not align with your legal theory, then how do you deal with those situations?
Greta,
Okay,
I will
would
come
you
in
like me to
there.
answer? You go ahead, Arthur.
Oh,
You go ahead.
yeah.
And it goes back to our earlier point, is that counsel and the experts talking fairly on. And it doesn't always go down well, but I think it's much better at an early stage where, and I see the terms fit for purpose, and you say, guys, no, it's not the case. These are the issues, but that's not going to wash it. Also, it gives us an opportunity sometimes, and I go there and say, you know what, some of this area I need help in. I'm not an expert on that aspect or that aspect, especially when it comes to metallurgy in my case. The basic stuff, but if it gets detailed metallurgy, detailed corrosion, we're going to get a corrosion expert in, and you can build the case. Okay, and I think that's good talking it and avoid the situation that we write some report towards a week before it's got to be submitted. Counsel reads it and says, "My goodness me, my statement of claim is out the window." So, and I think that's the thing, is communication. Deal with those things as early as possible and understand the issues.
So, Michael, would you like to say anything on this?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty brief, but I think, where we're all getting at is, I think we're all hitting a similar point here, and it goes back to something Simon said earlier around the fact that an expert is not a hired gun, and if they do go down that pathway and they're forced by counsel into taking some narrative that they've formed early on without it actually matching to the reality of the situation, it's actually counsel shooting themselves in the foot, because the expert loses all credibility. The tribunal's not going to have time for it, and they're more likely to take a step back and think, this is pointless for me. What actual evidence do I have in front of me? And I think the way to get around it is actually to view this as where you have an expert that takes a preliminary conclusion that contradicts your original theory. That should be important information for counsel. They should pause at that point, and maybe it's a matter of having a very quick call to explain if it's a misunderstanding as to what their view is, or to say, maybe they don't have the full information. Sure, that's a very different scenario to what we're talking about here. But if it's a case where they truly have a completely different opinion to the case that counsel has initially put forward, often that's a strong signal to counsel that they might need to think about how they can reframe their claim. Because often it's not the case that the expert totally disagrees on the fact of liability. It's just where it actually comes down to. It might not be fitness for purpose. It might be a different provision that you need to rely on. I appreciate that can be difficult to change at a late stage in an arbitration, but if you have early engagement, and even if you filed your request for arbitration and suddenly, you're at the next stage now, tribunals are alive to the fact that an expert might not necessarily be on board right off the bat. They might not look well upon you totally changing your case, but if you can reframe it slightly so that it actually matches what the evidence shows and what the expert is going to very robustly testify to, then I think you've got a much stronger claim. So I don't think it's a case of needing to change their conclusion. I think that's going to shoot yourself in the foot. It's a matter of thinking, what can I do with this information they're now giving me? Can I reframe my claim? Do I have to reconsider potentially settlement? And the nuclear option, do I need to change my expert, which I think can be a really bad look, especially if you're in a later stage of the arbitration. You might consult a different expert to see, is this expert just way off track? Or in reality, is everyone going to agree on this? And I really need to be rethinking about how I want to run my case. I'll pause there.
Simon, would you like to share your experience, or if you would like to highlight your views on that?
Yeah, look, I suppose it does require a reassessment.
Yeah.
I'll say that. So a reassessment either of the way in which you're running the case, but fundamentally, um, I'm not saying that you sort of run the white flag and give up on the case, but it definitely is a moment to pause and reconsider the merits of the position and perhaps the settlement strategy, where you have a very strong position that you feel like it is backed up by the facts and your expert analysis. You may be more willing to go deep into an arbitration and invest time and money into what the outcome of that might be. But if you're hitting those sorts of major snags early on, perhaps that investment might not be justified. Um, I have noticed that there's. Did you want me to deal with one or two of the questions that came through, Sveta?
The in the Q&A section.
Yes.
Yeah, because I've been told we are just left with 8 minutes.
Okay.
So right now I'll be taking two questions. One is for the legal expert itself. So the question is, how do you structure your pleadings around the causation? Simon and Michael, would you like to take this question? The question is, how do you structure your pleadings around causation?
Well, perhaps I'll just start by saying causation is a key and fundamental issue in these in any construction arbitration, but where you're talking about a technical failure and the impacts of that, causation is obviously really critical. In terms of the pleading itself, it's perhaps not the challenge. You need to identify the various elements that have happened that give rise to a claim, and then talk about what the impacts of those elements are, and then tie them together as best as you can. Where that gets difficult is actually in the proving. So that's where often we will get quantum and time experts to assist with that, and where the quality of records will really sort of be pay dirt. So we mentioned delay earlier and the disruption that can happen as a result of turbine failures, and that is often some of the more challenging areas for sort of proving causation, and from a lawyer's perspective, it's all about getting the best quality records and then briefing those to the best quality experts and asking them to sort of draw as straight a line as possible between what happened, what caused the problem, and then what the actual impact of that was.
Okay. I think, Michael, you want to say something? You want to add it?
I was just going to agree completely and
Yes.
say, I guess it goes back to this layering of the cake idea that I was talking about earlier. You've got to work with an expert or experts in order to understand that chain. And then when it comes to translating that into your pleading, it's a matter of telling the story then in a way that flows and supported by your documents and whatever evidence you can bring to bear. But I don't have much more to add on top of that.
Okay. The next question, I think this is the last question which we will take from the Q&A. So Arthur, this question is for you. So the question is, what challenges do you face as a technical expert in explaining complex engineering issues to the tribunal? I think I would read.
Shweta, yeah,
I would
no, that's
read.
fine.
Yeah, please
The
continue.
way
Yeah.
I like to handle that is, I take time in my reports to describe the concepts. And I start off sometimes, I have a bit of a theory section. If you're talking about resonance vibrations, why they occur and how they occur and why, it's important that people understand that it's a certain condition that happens. It's much higher. You need to explain that, and I always try and bear in mind the audience, even if they are engineers, unless they've dealt with this specific, mechanical engineer, they might not understand these concepts. So you've got to get to that. And that's the one. The other one is I also describe the plant, which I think sometimes people miss. And I make sure that people know if it's a gas turbine, how it detailed description, not rewrite the OEM, how it works, how the gas flows, and the important parts. If it was a lubrication failure, just some background on how the system works. And obviously written for the layman. I like to use a lot of graphics. I have sometimes been said it looks a bit like a comic book, but the old adage that a picture paints 1,000 words. And I make graphics so it's understandable. Spend a lot of time laying out and making sure it's logical. Not always that easy. Also try and be conscious of the questions that are asked, that when you read the report and answer them, it's sort of all touched. It's not always that easy. Another one is try and limit my pause, not always successful. But, and I perhaps a little bit tongue in cheek sometimes say that, more than 40 pages, people get lost. Now, that's not always necessary. There are experts' reports that are 400-500 pages. And, sometimes that's just not necessary. And bear in mind, if the tribunal can read it, it makes sense and it ties up, as opposed to putting a lot of verbiage in, cutouts, things like that. I prefer not to do it that way. That's how it goes. So that's my thing. If we don't always get to 40 pages, and then well evidenced. I spend time to try and make sure if they do check, it leads them to the right ones.
Thank you. I think we are at the end of this session. So I would request the attendees to email your questions to us, and we will have the speakers answer your questions later on. And let's close this session. As we conclude, I think this session has been very, very useful in understanding how a technical or a turbine failure are and how they can lead to claims under the contract and how they are dealt in arbitration. So I would like to thank our panelists today who have taken out time to for this masterclass, and all the participants who were actively involved in this particular session, because we have received many queries from the attendees. And yeah, thank you all. Have a good day.
Yes, thank you all so much. Many thanks again to our wonderful speakers and attendees for making this happen. Have a lovely day. And just another reminder that this session was recorded. We'll be sending the recording across to you all in the coming days. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank
Thank you.
you. Good day.